In 1943, a mother in Ukraine boiled wallpaper to feed her children, not because it was food, but because the glue in it still had calories. This wasn't desperation. This was daily life. While soldiers faced bullets, civilians faced silence, empty fields, vanished rations, and a hunger that rewrote the meaning of survival. There were no stockpiles, no supplies, just dead soil, scorched kitchens, and mouths that still needed feeding. They turned to bark, burnt bones, weeds scraped from ditches. They mixed sawdust into flour, fried rat meat in leftover engine grease. Nothing was wasted. Not even ash. We think of war as fire and steel, but for millions, it was about finding something that wouldn't kill you before the cold did. Today, we uncover 10 of the darkest food tricks civilians used to survive World War II. Not from manuals, not from training, from hunger itself. Hit like and subscribe to uncover the skills they never wanted to pass down because they hoped no one would ever need them again. Number 1, tree resin syrup. In war-torn forests of Eastern Europe, where sugar vanished before the first winter ended, families turned to trees not for wood, but for sweetness. They called it poor man's syrup. But it wasn't pity they were after. It was survival. Resin, thick, amber, bittersweet, dripped slowly from pine and birch trees when wounded with shallow cuts. Early each morning, villagers would trek into the woods with a dull knife and a cloth scrap, a cut along the bark, just deep enough, and the resin would begin to weep. It took hours, days sometimes, but that golden sap meant one more spoonful of energy. They didn't drink it raw. They couldn't. The resin was boiled slowly, mixed with traces of snow or wild herbs to cut the bitterness. Over 5, it thickened into something barely sweet, barely edible, but warm and sticky enough to coat a stale crust of bread. For a starving child, it might as well have been honey. Some women smeared it onto boiled roots to make them chewable. Others used it as a glaze over dried berries or crumbled bark cakes. The sick licked it straight off cloth, believing it helped soothe sore throats and cracked lips. And when the resin supply slowed, they moved deeper into the forest, risking patrols, frostbite, and silence. Because a single ounce could stretch a meal, could turn bitterness into hope. It was crude, primitive, but it worked. This wasn't a recipe. It was resistance with a wooden spoon. And it wasn't just sugar. It was a reminder that sweetness, even in war, could still be carved out of the trees. One forgotten method, one more taste of life held together with sap. Number 2, clay pot coolers. In cities where ice had melted into memory and electricity was nothing more than a rumor, villagers learned to cool food without cold. They turned to earth and clay. Small pots shaped by hand or salvaged from market ruins became their last line of defense against spoilage, not because they kept food hot, but because they knew how to make them breathe. The trick wasn't in the pot. It was in the placement. 2 clay vessels, one slightly smaller than the other, were placed one inside the other, with the space between packed tightly with damp soil or ash. The entire unit was buried waist-deep into shaded ground near trees or under collapsed sheds. Water was poured over the top layer, and then again and again. As the sun dried the outer surface, the moisture within evaporated, pulling heat away from the core. What sat inside roots, scraps of meat, hardened bread, stayed cooler by several precious degrees. No noise, no wires, just physics, instinct, and clay. Mothers placed foraged greens inside for just one extra day of freshness. Some even stored fermented milk wrapped in leaves, preserving its bite long enough to feed sick infants. When heat waves came, they lined the pot walls with soaked cloth. It wasn't perfect, but it was survival stitched together with dirt and memory. Even soldiers passing through ruined villages were shocked by how these crude devices outlasted steel safes. It wasn't innovation. It was inheritance, an ancient trick reborn in the shadow of war. And in a world without ice, it kept hope from rotting. Number 3, rat and pigeon frying. In the darkest alleys of war-starved cities where fields gave nothing and markets held only dust, 2 creatures still moved freely: rats and pigeons. And they were hunted, not for sport, for the pan, old men with string snares, mothers with broken umbrellas fashioned into traps. Every movement was calculated, every capture a victory. Rats were caught near drains and bombed cellars. Pigeons fat from feasting on corpses and waste were lured with crumbs and caught with baskets weighted with stone. Once caught, the preparation was as silent as the catch. The rat's fur was burned off over flame, then scraped clean with metal shards or even glass, guts removed with twigs, organs buried far from sight. Pigeons were plucked with bare hands, feathers twisted off, skin seared with coals. Bones weren't discarded, they were boiled later for broth. Not a single part wasted. Frying came last. Cooking oil was rare. So animal fat saved from previous kills or scrounged from tin scraps was poured into dented pans. Some mixed the fat with powdered soap or candle wax to stretch it. Heat was kept low to avoid detection. Salt, ash, spice, burnt herbs. Firewood was saved from furniture, chair legs, doors, anything not already burned. The smell? It was unbearable. Not because it stank, because it reminded you that someone nearby had meat. Meals were eaten in silence, often in corners, shared only with blood. Soldiers on patrol through civilian zones sometimes gagged at the sight, but more often they asked for a bite. Because by the third year of war, rat and pigeon weren't filth. They were protein. Dignity wasn't in what you ate. It was in the fact you still ate it all. And in frying those creatures, civilians didn't just feed their bodies. They told the war it hadn't won yet. Number 4. Peel ferments. When every edible part had been scraped, chewed, or boiled twice, one thing still remained. Peels. Banana, potato, beetroot, apple skins that once filled compost bins or animal troughs became the last edible frontier. But they weren't consumed raw. They were transformed. Fermentation wasn't science. It was desperation guided by smell and time. In crumbling basements and broken barns, families gathered discarded peels, often collected from bins outside military kitchens or scavenged from empty market stalls. Rotting wasn't feared. It was welcomed. The longer the decay, the stronger the chance for transformation. Peels were rinsed with dirty water, chopped fine, then layered inside jars with crushed leaves or ground roots. No vinegar, just warmth, time, and pressure. Weights, sometimes stones, were placed on top. The jars were hidden under floorboards or buried near stove walls where heat stayed constant. After a week, a sour aroma signaled progress. Once the bubbling began, it was ready. It didn't taste like food, it tasted like survival. Pale liquids from fermented skins were sipped slowly, used to calm stomachs wrecked by hunger. The fibrous mash was spread over black bread, mixed into porridge, or fed to infants when milk vanished. Civilians who mastered this process became lifelines. One woman, in Warsaw, known only by her apron stains, kept 5 neighbors alive through winter, with nothing but peel brews and boiled husks. And when supplies tightened further, the liquid itself became trade. A spoonful of fermented peel water could fetch a scarf, a jar half a week's worth of dried beans. It wasn't about taste. It was about extending what no longer had value. And when even peels disappeared, they fermented leaves. This wasn't cuisine. It was chemistry born in famine. Flavor was an afterthought. Safety, a gamble. But in a world that forgot how to feed itself, they remembered how to wait, how to coax life from rot. One jar, one trick, one more breath earned from what others threw away. Number 5, leaf-covered cooking. When pots cracked and lids were lost, civilians didn't stop cooking. They turned to the ground and to leaves. In the wreckage of kitchens, people began wrapping food in whatever the trees hadn't burned. Large leaves, cabbage, grapevine, chestnut, even bark-thin scraps from mulberry became nature's foil, not for flavor, for function. The method was crude but effective. Food, if you could call it that, was packed tightly in layers. Sometimes boiled weeds, other times powdered grains mixed with water. The bundles were wrapped again and again, tied with twine or thin strips of soaked grass, then buried under hot ash or placed near embers without direct flame. No pot, no pan, just smoke, heat, patience. The outer leaves charred, the inner ones softened. Steam built inside the wrapping, slow cooking whatever scraps lay within. The result? A warm mash infused with the faint taste of leaf oil, bitter, earthy, but edible. Families would eat straight from the bundle. Peeling each layer felt like unwrapping a gift, one that didn't taste good but reminded them they still had hands, mouths, breath. Sometimes, leaves were stacked in pits, layer after layer, alternating food and green cover, then sealed with mud. The pit held heat overnight, feeding 10 people from a single fireless hole. It wasn't culinary invention, it was camouflage. Smoke meant danger, smell meant theft, flame meant being seen. But buried in leaves, food cooked without a trace. Even soldiers adopted the technique when stranded. They learned it not from manuals, but from villagers who had mastered silence, flame, and hunger. This method wasn't passed down through recipes. It was passed down through survival. A leaf, a spark, and a hand that still remembered what warmth could do. And from that came one more meal. Not because it was delicious, because it wasn't ashes. Number 6, Ashcrust loaves. When flour was gone, when yeast was a memory, and when ovens lay in rubble, people still made bread. They called it many names, but survivors knew it by the sound it made when tapped. Hard, hollow, and real. Ashcrust loaves weren't shaped for taste. They were shaped to endure. In ruined homes and forest clearings, hands mixed together whatever they could grind: acorns, weeds, bark, even dry peas smashed into powder. To hold it together, some used boiled water mixed with stale broth or fermented root water. There was no salt, no oil, only survival mashed into a lump. What made it bread was the outer shell. A pit was dug. Firewood twigs, dry hay, furniture pieces was burned to embers. Then, the embers were pushed aside, and the dough was dropped directly into the hot ash and covered again. No pan, no barrier. The outside charred black. But inside, a dense, doughy core barely held together. People knocked it with their knuckles to see if it had cooked through. The louder the sound, the better the chances it wouldn't fall apart. The ash hardened into a crust, sealing the moisture, protecting the fragile center. They learned not to flinch when their bread tasted like soot. Mothers scraped the outer layer gently, collecting what little softness remained. Ashes were reused, mixed with water and filtered for lye to stretch the next batch even further. These loaves didn't rise, they didn't fluff, they didn't break clean, but they filled the stomach. Even a quarter of one could slow the hunger. A full piece, shared among 5, was a feast. Soldiers, when lost behind enemy lines, traded bullets for such bread. Not because it was good, but because it stayed warm long after everything else had gone cold. Ashcrust loaves weren't made with love. They were made with memory of what bread once was, and what it still needed to be. Not soft, not golden, but real, and enough to last one more day. Number 7, soil-washed broth. In the final winters of World War II, when even scavengers had nothing left to steal, people began boiling hope itself, not in pans, but in dirt-lined pits. It was called soil-washed broth, not because they drank the soil, but because they had nothing left to wash away. The idea was born out of desperation and grounded in rural wisdom. When food disappeared, when even nettles, roots, and bones became rare, civilians began collecting discarded scraps, husks of beans, dry nettle stalks, leaves too fibrous to chew. These weren't food, these were shadows of meals. But boiling them in plain water made only bitter tea. So villagers turned to the earth itself. They didn't eat the soil, they filtered through it. A method passed quietly from grandmother to daughter. First, dig a shallow depression and heat a thick layer of dry soil until it cracked. Then, layer scavenged scraps over the top, pour boiled water through the mix, and let the broth pass through the hot soil base. The result? A gritty, mineral-rich liquid, thicker than tea, heavier on the tongue, and faintly metallic. Not tasty, but heavy enough to give the illusion of eating. This wasn't superstition. Soil contains trace elements, iron, magnesium, calcium, especially in clay-heavy regions. When filtered through ash or charcoal layers, it also acted as a rudimentary purifier, removing visible grime. Families lined clay pots with baked earth and poured the broth through cloth. Some added crushed charcoal or burnt bone for warmth retention. Others used moss-lined filters to catch sediment. In Poland, this broth was mixed with powdered bark for texture. In Ukraine, stale rye was soaked in it to soften before consumption. In Latvia, dry lichen was boiled with soil-filtered water to create a thick paste spread on bread ends. Soldiers stranded without rations watched civilians make this and began copying the ritual. They didn't ask questions, they just held their cups with both hands, hoping the heat would reach their fingers before it vanished. There was no recipe, no seasoning, only instinct. Because in war, survival didn't always look like a meal. Sometimes it looked like muddy steam, and tasted like memory clinging to warmth. Number 8, charcoal tea. When water turned foul and fuel ran out, survivors didn't reach for medicine. They reached for fire. Charcoal tea wasn't brewed for flavor. It was brewed for survival. In the collapsing rural belts of Eastern Europe, entire villages were forced to make a choice: drink contaminated water and risk dysentery, or find a way to purify it without modern tools. Boiling required firewood. Firewood meant noise, and noise could invite soldiers. So they turned to charcoal, not store-bought, not processed, just burnt wood, crushed into a coarse powder by hand. Pine, oak, birch, whatever had burned clean in last night's fire. A spoonful was stirred into hot water, sometimes warm, sometimes barely above room temperature, and left to settle. Within minutes, the water turned black, thick, clouded like ink, but that darkness carried protection. Charcoal, in its raw form, is highly porous. It binds to toxins, bacteria, even heavy metals. In traditional medicine, charcoal has long been used to treat poisoning and digestive illness. For these war survivors, it became a substitute for sanitation. One peasant woman in Croatia taught to chew the bits left at the bottom, not for taste, but to prevent stomach cramps. In Serbia, partisans carried small pouches of crushed charcoal hidden in tobacco tins, adding it to puddle water before every sip. It wasn't a perfect filter, but it was the difference between fever and fighting on. Some even added burnt onion skin or dried mint, not to mask the taste, but to calm the bitterness. What mattered wasn't comfort, it was the ritual, the pause, the act of treating water before trusting it. Charcoal tea didn't cure illness. It prevented it from starting. In the camps, whispers spread quickly. If you felt your gut turn, drink it fast. If your lips turned dry, stir more ash. There were no doctors, just embers, and knowledge passed in silence. Every blackened cup carried a memory of mothers grinding soot, of their spitting grit, of soldiers watching from shadows and copying what they saw. It wasn't medicine. It was instinct, hardened by war. And in a world without safety, even a mouthful of black water could taste like control. Number 9, salt brick licking. When meals vanished and bodies weakened, survivors didn't chase flavor, they chased minerals. Without salt, muscles cramped, wounds festered, thoughts grew cloudy. It wasn't seasoning, it was survival. That's why hidden in the darkest corners of cellars, barns, and underground caches, one object was guarded more fiercely than gold: the salt brick, a coarse gray block, sometimes chipped, often soiled, but every edge mattered. Farmers in war-torn Ukraine carved them from evaporated riverbeds. In Poland, livestock salt licks were stolen and stashed for human use. Even in bombed-out German cities, civilians would scrape crumbling mortar from walls, desperate for sodium, trapped in lime dust. But the method that shocked soldiers the most? Licking. Slowly. Silently. Not biting, not shaving, just drawing moisture across the surface, letting the mineral seep into dry tongues and cracking lips. It wasn't just hydration. It was preservation. Salt regulates nerve signals. Without it, your body shuts down. And during long winters, with nothing but boiled roots and dirty water, it became the only defense against collapse. They were taught not to overdo it. 3 licks, then pass it, a mother whispered in hiding. Too much salt on an empty stomach could do more harm than good. But just enough? It could steady shaking hands. One partisan group in Belarus used salt bricks as trade items. 1 hour with a brick for a day's labor. Another in Hungary hid theirs in a bag of soot to deter thieves. No one wanted to reach into black ash for what they couldn't eat directly. Some boiled water with salt chips to mimic broth. Others rubbed the brick against raw potato peels before roasting, believing it pulled bitterness away. This wasn't about taste. It was chemistry, camouflaged as instinct. Salt bricks didn't just keep people alive. They taught restraint, patience, the discipline of rationing something so basic, yet so sacred. In war, nothing is wasted. Even a silent lick can mean the difference between fainting and fighting. 1 brick, 1 breath steadier, that's all they needed. And when salt was gone, they licked stone, just to remember the taste. Number 10. Boiled seed pods. When the soil stopped giving, survivors turned to what others trampled. Seed pods dry, bitter, twisted husks became lifelines. Not harvested from farms, but gathered from roadside weeds, abandoned orchards, forest floors. These weren't crops. They were leftovers of nature's last offering, hollow in sound, dusty in texture. But they held something war couldn't take. Trace calories, hidden oils, microscopic starch. In the ravaged outskirts of Yugoslavia, foragers scraped seed pods from trees once planted only for shade. The goal wasn't taste, it was density. Every boiled pod held a kernel of sustenance, even if just enough to calm a stomach screaming for substance. They were soaked first long, bitter hours in cold water, not to soften, but to pull out poisons. Many of these wild pods, acacia, locust, even certain pine, were naturally alkaloid-rich. Left raw, they could paralyze, but boiled carefully, rinsed twice, and simmered again, they transformed. The broth was muddy, the pods rubbery. But in a world where bread was myth, it was survival on a spoon. Those who couldn't find fire still found ways. They crushed dried pods with rocks, then steeped the dust in sunlight-heated rainwater. What settled wasn't food, it was memory of it. A trick for the mind, a delay for the body. In some regions, pods were ground to powder and mixed with scraped bark to form a paste. They wrapped it in cloth, flattened it under stones, then sliced it thin. Not for sharing, for chewing slowly, between hours of silence. Medicinal uses evolved too. Pod water was sometimes used to soothe sore mouths or inflamed skin. But even here, every use came with caution. One mistake, one misidentified pod, and relief became collapse. So they developed systems passed through whispers. Which pods to boil twice, which to roast first, which to burn outright. Never touch again. It wasn't culinary. It was chemistry born from famine. In bombed-out buildings, old sacks held nothing but seed pods, sorted by shape and bitterness. Each one a fragment of nutrition. Each one a decision. To eat, to wait, to keep going. The world called it desperation. But for them, it was strategy. Because when the land turned quiet and even weeds began to vanish, those who knew how to boil a husk lived longer. Now, you know why World War II survival didn't begin in the kitchen. It began in the dirt, the ash, and the silence between meals. It wasn't about recipes. It was about refusal. Refusal to die hungry. Refusal to let the body give up before the mind. What we call desperation today, they called dinner. Every trick, boiling seed pods, licking salt bricks, fermenting peels wasn't just a meal substitute. It was an act of rebellion, a way to push back against a world collapsing around them. With nothing but fire, instinct, and bitter-tasting hope, they rewrote what it meant to eat. These weren't dishes passed down in cookbooks. They were secrets carved into memory, traded in whispers, hidden in smoke, and buried in basements. And if those lessons disappear, so does the grit that kept millions alive. So if this story stirred something in you, if you believe survival is more than storage and more than fierty, then don't let these truths vanish again. Hit like. Share it with someone who still thinks history is just dates and battles. And subscribe, because the past isn't gone. It's waiting to feed us one more truth.